The October wind whispered through the windows of the West Orange laboratory that afternoon in 1930, carrying with it a premonition that something extraordinary was about to be revealed. Thomas Alva Edison, then 83 years old, sat opposite, a young journalist whose name history has deliberately forgotten, his trembling hands making final adjustments to the recording equipment he himself had perfected decades before. What followed over the next 3 hours remained sealed in a secret Edison family vault for nearly a century, until recently a descendant decided the world was finally ready to hear the deepest, most unsettling words of humanity's greatest inventor. The recording begins with the familiar scratch of the phonograph, that distinctive hiss Edison had made possible, but his voice emerges unlike the one the world knew. It's no longer the confident voice of the man who had mastered electricity and illuminated cities, but something more vulnerable, more intimate, as if he were speaking not to posterity but to his own soul. Edison had requested this specific interview because he knew his days were numbered, and he harbored secrets he'd carried his entire life, experiences he'd never dared share with the scientific world that revered him. Throughout his career, Edison had been known for his practical and materialistic approach to life. He was the man of the incandescent light bulb, motion pictures, the phonograph, a genius who transformed abstract ideas into tangible realities. But what few knew is that, parallel to his revolutionary inventions, Edison conducted experiments of a completely different nature, investigations that explored the boundaries between the physical world and that which lay beyond common perception. These clandestine researches began after the death of his first wife, Mary Stilwell, in 1884, when Edison was consumed by an obsession that would forever change his understanding of existence. In the recording, his voice trembles slightly as he recalls that specific moment. 3 days after Mary's funeral, while working alone in his laboratory during the early hours of the morning, Edison witnessed something that defied every law of physics he knew. The lights in his laboratory began to flicker in a specific non-random sequence, as if someone were trying to communicate through Morse code. Initially, he attributed the phenomenon to some electrical problem, but when he deciphered the message, his blood ran cold. It was Mary's name, repeated 3 times, followed by a precise coordinate that corresponded exactly to the location where they had been married. This experience marked the beginning of a spiritual journey Edison kept absolutely secret. He began meticulously documenting a series of inexplicable phenomena that occurred in his presence, always related to the possibility of communicating with those who had passed. Unlike the mediums and spiritualists of his time, Edison approached these manifestations with the same scientific rigor he applied to his inventions. He developed sensitive instruments capable of detecting the subtlest electromagnetic variations, recorded temperature fluctuations that could not be explained by natural causes, and documented sound patterns that seemed to carry intelligent information. What intrigued Edison most was the electrical nature of these phenomena. His whole life had been dedicated to mastering electricity, and now he began to realize that human consciousness could somehow interact with electromagnetic fields in ways that official science did not yet understand. He developed the theory that the human soul was essentially a highly organized form of electrical energy, capable of maintaining its coherence even after the dissolution of the physical body. This energy, according to his observations, did not dissipate into nothingness, but transitioned to a parallel dimension where it continued to exist and evolve. In the recording, Edison describes in unsettling detail his experiments with what he called a spiritual telephone, an extremely sensitive device that supposedly could pick up the vibrations left by the souls of the dead. He worked on this project in absolute secrecy for over 2 decades, perfecting the technology and documenting hundreds of alleged communications. What he discovered terrified and fascinated him at the same time. The messages did not come from a distant and unknown afterlife, but from a dimension that coexisted with ours, separated only by a different vibrational frequency. Through these experiments, Edison began to map what he called spiritual geography, different levels or planes of existence where souls resided after physical death. He discovered that those who had died recently remained close to the earthly plane, still connected to the people and places they loved. Over time, These souls gradually moved to higher frequencies, but retained the ability to return and communicate when necessary. What impressed him most was the consistency of the information. Different sources confirmed the same details about the nature of the afterlife, creating a coherent picture that transcended any explanation based on coincidence or autosuggestion. Edison recounts in the recording how, during these years of secret research, he began to perceive signs that his own transition was approaching. These were not vague premonitions, but specific communications from Mary and other deceased relatives who were gradually preparing him for his departure. They showed him that death was not an end, but a transformation, a shift in frequency that would allow his consciousness to continue existing in a more refined and powerful form. This revelation completely changed his perspective on mortality and gave new meaning to all his earthly inventions. He began to understand that his creations in the physical world were merely reflections of an infinitely greater creativity that would manifest itself after his death. The electric light, which brought physical light to the world, was only a preparation for his future ability to radiate spiritual light to other evolving souls. The phonograph, which preserved human sounds and voices, was a harbinger of his ability to communicate across dimensions. Each of his inventions contained, at its core, a spiritual truth he was only beginning to fully grasp. The recording reveals how he came to perceive patterns and synchronicities in his life that had previously gone unnoticed. Specific numbers repeatedly appeared in his experiences, dates, times, technical measurements, forming a web of meaning that seemed to guide his discoveries. He began to suspect that his own existence was part of a larger plan, orchestrated by higher intelligences who were using him as a conduit to bring certain technologies to the world at the precise moment humanity was ready to receive them. He describes a particular experience that occurred in 1925, 5 years before this final interview. He was working late one night in his laboratory when he suddenly felt a powerful presence around him. The room temperature plummeted, and all his instruments began registering unusual activity. Then a voice he immediately recognized as his father's, deceased for decades, began speaking through the recording equipment. The message was crystal clear. He had been chosen before he was even born to be a bridge between the spiritual and physical worlds, a translator of cosmic energies into technologies that would elevate human consciousness. His spiritual father revealed that every inventor, every genius, every person who contributes significantly to the advancement of humanity is actually an old soul who agrees to incarnate with a specific mission. He had lived many past lives, always as a builder, a creator, someone who brought order to chaos and light to darkness. His current inventions were merely the culmination of knowledge accumulated over multiple existences, knowledge that resided in his soul and manifested when the time was ripe. This revelation completely transformed his understanding of his own identity. He was no longer simply nom du inventor, the American inventor, but an eternal consciousness that had chosen this specific incarnation to serve the evolution of humanity. His struggles, his failures, his victories, all were part of a larger design that could only be understood from a broader spiritual perspective. In the recording, he shares how he began receiving visits from other inventors and geniuses who had already passed on, nom de un inventor famoso, who showed him that art and science were aspects of the same divine truth. Nom de outro inventor famoso, his former rival, who revealed the secrets of energy transmission through parallel dimensions. Nom de un terceiro inventor famoso, who taught him about the connections between earthly and spiritual electricity. Each of these masters contributed a piece to the cosmic puzzle he was beginning to assemble. He realized that the competition and conflicts he had experienced during his earthly life were illusions created by the limited perspective of physical existence. On the spiritual plane, all inventors and creators worked in collaboration, each contributing their unique part to the progress of universal consciousness. The rivalry between him and nom de outro inventor famoso, which had dominated the newspapers of his time, turned out to be a necessary dramatic representation to draw the world's attention to certain crucial scientific discoveries. He describes how in the months leading up to this interview, the spiritual communications intensified dramatically. Nome da Esposa not only visited him regularly, but also brought with her other departed family and friends, creating a true spiritual family, awaiting him on the other side. They showed him visions of what he could expect after his transition, not an abstract and distant heaven, but dimensions of infinite creativity where his inventiveness could express itself without the limitations of physical matter. In these visions, he saw himself creating technologies of pure light, instant communication devices between souls, instruments capable of harmonizing the vibrational frequencies of entire planets. He understood that his true work as an inventor was only just beginning, and that his earthly contributions were merely the first chapter of a much grander story. The recording captures a particularly moving moment when he describes his last direct communication with Nome da Esposa, which occurred just a week before the interview. She had appeared to him not as a memory or a ghost, but as a vibrant and radiant presence, more real than any physical experience he had ever had. Nome da Esposa revealed to him that true love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transcending all dimensional barriers and keeping souls connected through eternities. She showed him that his upcoming transition would be smooth and natural, like falling asleep in one world and waking up in another. There would be no pain or fear, only a gradual expansion of consciousness that would allow him to perceive realities that had always been present, but beyond physical perception. He understood that death was, in fact, a birth into a fuller and more powerful form of existence. He confesses in the recording that he spent the last years of his life consciously preparing for this transition. He developed meditation and concentration, techniques that allowed him to expand his consciousness beyond the limits of his physical body, experiencing states of being that anticipated his future spiritual existence. These practices gave him a serenity and understanding that completely transformed his perspective on mortality. He began to realize that each person carries within them the ability to communicate with spiritual dimensions, but most remain unaware of this ability due to the distractions and limitations of material life. The technology he had developed throughout his career was in large part an attempt to create external bridges for capabilities that already existed internally in every human being. The recording reveals how he came to understand that his most important inventions were not physical devices, but the shifts in consciousness they provoked in humanity. The electric light bulb not only brought physical illumination, but symbolized the awakening of human consciousness to previously unimaginable possibilities. The phonograph not only preserved human voices, but demonstrated that consciousness could transcend temporal limits. Each invention carried, encoded in its essence, a spiritual lesson that elevated human understanding of its own divine nature. Father describes how in the final weeks before the interview, he began experiencing what he called dimensional overlays, moments where his consciousness simultaneously existed in the physical world and spiritual dimensions. During these episodes, he could perceive the presence of beings of light constantly surrounding him, guiding his actions and inspiring his ideas. He understood that he had never truly worked alone. Each discovery, each invention, was the result of a collaboration with higher intelligences operating through him. These experiences gave him a profound understanding of the nature of inspiration and creativity. He realized that ideas weren't created by the human mind, but channeled through it from dimensions where all knowledge already existed in potential form. The role of the inventor, the artist, the genius, was to serve as a conscious conduit through which these eternal truths could manifest in the physical world. Father shares in the recording a revelation he considers the most important of his entire life: the discovery that individual consciousness is, in fact, a facet of an infinite universal consciousness. Each person, each soul, each life form is a unique expression of this supreme consciousness, experiencing itself through countless simultaneous perspectives. Physical death is merely the withdrawal of consciousness from a specific perspective, allowing its reintegration with broader aspects of its eternal nature. This understanding completely transformed his perception of the purpose of human life. It wasn't about accumulating successes or material achievements, but about expanding consciousness, developing the capacity for love, and contributing to the collective evolution of humanity. Each life was a precious opportunity for spiritual growth, a chance to refine the soul through experience and service to others. Father reveals that he began to perceive his own death not as an end, but as a graduation, a promotion to higher levels of existence and responsibility. He would be able to continue his work of invention and creation, but on a cosmic scale, helping to develop spiritual technologies that would facilitate the evolution of entire civilizations. The recording captures a moment of profound emotion when Father describes his last night in the West Orange laboratory. He was alone, surrounded by the inventions of a lifetime, when he suddenly felt the presence of everyone he had loved and lost. Wife was there, along with his parents, dear friends, and even pets he had had in childhood. But more than that, he perceived the presence of all the people whose lives had been touched by his inventions, millions of human beings who had experienced light, sound, and progress thanks to his work. In this moment of supreme revelation, Father understood that he had fulfilled his earthly mission. He had served as a conduit through which divine energies brought literal and metaphorical illumination to the world. His inventions would continue to inspire future generations of inventors and dreamers, perpetuating a legacy that transcended his individual physical existence. Father confesses that he did not fear death because he had previously experienced states of consciousness that showed him the continuity of existence. He knew that his personality, his memories, his creative ability, everything would continue in a refined and expanded form. The only difference would be his liberation from the physical limitations that, paradoxically, would allow him to be more creative and powerful than he had ever been during his earthly life. The recording ends with Father making a surprising prediction. He states that he will return to continue his work, not through reincarnation but through direct inspiration for future inventors. He will become a guiding presence for those who, like him, are called to serve as bridges between the spiritual and physical worlds. His ideas and his energy will continue to manifest through other people who are ready to channel his accumulated wisdom. He reveals that he had already identified several of these people, young inventors and dreamers who carried within them the same divine spark that had inspired him throughout his life. Through them, he would continue to contribute to the progress of humanity, introducing technologies that would gradually prepare the human species for its eventual collective spiritual evolution. Father concludes the interview with a prophetic message about the future of humanity. He foresees a time when interdimensional communication will become as common as the telephone communication of his time. People will naturally develop abilities that will allow them to perceive and interact with spiritual realities, making death only a conscious transition between different states of existence. He envisions a future where technology and spirituality will completely merge, creating devices that will amplify the natural psychic abilities of human beings. These inventions will allow people to communicate with their deceased loved ones, access knowledge from higher dimensions, and consciously participate in the cosmic evolution of consciousness. Father expresses his conviction that the true technological revolution was yet to come, not a revolution based on the manipulation of matter, but on the conscious manipulation of consciousness itself. The inventors of the future would not only create physical devices but tools for spiritual expansion, instruments that would help humanity awaken to its true divine nature. The recording preserves his final words, spoken in a voice that had regained all its strength and clarity. Human life is only the first chapter of an infinite story of growth and discovery. The soul that animates each person is eternal, indestructible, and destined to evolve through increasingly grand and sublime experiences. Physical death is simply the turning of a page, revealing new horizons of possibility and adventure. Father affirms that his earthly inventions were only preparatory exercises for his true work as an architect of spiritual realities. He will continue to invent, to create, to illuminate, but now in dimensions where his imagination will know no physical limits. And through his continued presence, he will help others discover that they too are cosmic inventors, capable of creating realities through the sheer power of focused consciousness. The recording ends abruptly, But what remains is a feeling of profound transformation. Father had shared not only his personal beliefs about the afterlife, but a revolutionary vision of the nature of human existence. His words carry the weight of direct experience, the authority of someone who had investigated the deepest mysteries with the same scientific rigor he applied to his most famous inventions.